I'll just dive right in. I wanted to start out with the definition of terms because we're talking about sex and gender. And actually, these are, although there is a lot of overlap and the two work in concert, there's a lot to be said for each of, thinking about sex and gender by themselves. So sex is sort of regarded as sort of the biological foundation of chromosomal and gonadal development, while gender sort of has more of a definition associated with sociocultural elements that help to shape sort of our gender and sexual identity throughout life. And in many of this sort of work that I think about at a broad level, we really sort of don't tend to ask about gender identity, especially in aging cohorts. And in fact, in many of the studies that I work with many studies, we assume the sex that's assigned at birth. And because of that, the concepts of sex and gender do tend to get incredibly tangled up and hard to tease apart. And we really need to work harder on that. But I think it behooves us to be transparent when thinking about these concepts, especially when thinking about these broader sort of definitions of resilience and resistance in disease. But why do we care about sex and gender differences, particularly in aging and AD? And I think just relating to the first set of talks, the idea is not about risk. It's also about the positives and the huge opportunities that we can understand within the concept of sex and gender. So the first thing is that we have known for a long time now that women do far outweigh men in the differences in prevalence rates, particularly for Alzheimer's disease, dementia. However, it is a little bit more complicated when you think about incidence rates, and there's a lot more debate to be had there, and I'm happy to speak to that at another time. But we also know the mortality rates are higher for women, particularly past a certain age of about 80. Mortality rates are higher for women with AD dementia. But we also need to think of the other side of this coin, the positives, which is that across all countries of the world, women far outlive men. This is also the longevity of women, and I'm thinking primarily about homogametic species, so the two chromosomes are copied. They tend to outlive the heterogametic species. And so there is really sort of a large story to tell in terms of resilience. And then finally, this also translates to thinking about dementia. Women tend to outlive men in terms of the length of time they are with dementia as well. And so there really is this very strong concept of resilience and resistance as well when thinking about sex and gender. So this is, I'm actually the chair of the Sex and Gender Professional Interest Area at the Alzheimer's Association iStart program. I'm very proud to be in that role, and I will for the next year, I believe. And what we have done recently is we partnered with the the Reserve and Resilience peer at iStart to write a really big review on sex and gender pathways to resilience. And we called it a framework. We've just had it published a month ago, and I can circulate the PDF, but that's one of the reading materials. And what we were really interested in is trying to get ourselves from the age framework to the cognitive decline piece. And there's multiple pathways here. One is through resilience, thinking about risk factors like education, affective disorders, cardiovascular health, a lot of these sort of factors we've been discussing today. But there's also another way to get to cognitive decline, or another moderating factor to get to cognitive decline, which is via the sort of brain maintenance and brain reserve component. And then there's another sort of more disease relevant pathway, which gets you to cognitive decline via proteinopathies. And there's a lot of sort of moderating factors that are associated with that. But one thing we really wanted to highlight in this particular review, and that you can see in these sort of orange, yellow boxes, is the sex and gender effect. And throughout all of these pathways, there have been published and in some cases quite widely published and well-known interactions and intersections with sex and gender. And there's a few hypothetical models for how sex and gender might play a role in associating between this sort of age and, in this case, memory outcome. One thing that we have known for a very, very, very long time now is that women outperform men on almost every neuropsychological task you can think of. This is not everything, but in particular, verbal memory is particularly differentiable between the sexes, and women tend to outperform men. So one way to think about this is that just women perform better at the baseline, whatever that age may be, and then there's just a slow decline over time. The other framework which we think is, or the paradigm which we think is much more convincing and has been shown in quite a few studies, is that there may be sort of this hinge point, a point in which women are in fact more resilient than men throughout life for a period of time. And then the disease burden, or whatever the particular risk factor might be, may become so saturated, or there is enough burden and enough risk factors that have just sort of caused this hinge point to occur, and then women start to really decline rapidly post that certain point relative to men. And this sort of, I'm just going to give an amuse-bouche of some of the examples of this in the literature. This is a beautiful study by Jessica Caldwell and colleagues from a few years back. This is cross-sectional data, but essentially what they were showing was you've got one set of box plots on the left and one on the right. This one on the left is healthy controls. On the right is symptomatic patients. On the left in the healthy controls, what they're simply showing you is men and women and whether or not they have elevated levels of AD biomarkers or not in cerebrospinal fluid. And what you can see here is that men tend to really do poorly on a memory task. So a higher score on that y-axis is poorer memory performance. And you can see here that with that elevated level of burden, men are doing much more poorly. This has been shown time and time again. Even in the instances where there is elevated levels of burden, women tend to outperform men in their memory performance. But by the time you get to the symptomatic case, you start to see in the women, there's this really broadened and expansive difference between those women who have elevated levels of amyloid and tau versus those who don't. And this difference is markedly different relative to men. The downside of that is that it is cross-sectional. So the longitudinal example here is what we had published at around a similar time. At the outset, what I really wanted to highlight here is the sort of the amount of risk that I was just talking about before. So I wanted to see what would happen if you had high levels of amyloid and if you were an E4 carrier, what would happen to men and women over time. This is 980 individuals that were sort of harmonized across multiple cohorts. This is something that we do a lot in our lab. And we were interested in cognitive trajectories over time. This was about 6.5 years in all. And you see women in the red, the very sort of strong red line, and in the green are the men. Both of these groups are E4 carriers who have high amyloid. It's the women who are far outperforming men at the baseline, even in the face of all of these risk factors, but rapidly declining. So there's really sort of this strong, I think, and quite convincing trend for this hinge point of lost resilience over time. And so I wanted to sort of, oh no, let me think here. What was supposed to be in this spot? But what we really wanted to sort of tease apart is all of these intersections. So we were talking just before about all of these risk factors that could occur. And what we do in our lab is really think about generalizability to some extent, which is taking as many of these weird cohorts as possible, putting them together and gaining as much diversity as we possibly can, and developing very large models, predictive models of what might be an element of cognitive resilience. Right now, what we're trying to do is gather about 20,000 participants across, it's up to nearly 20 cohorts now. That doesn't even include NAC, which is in and of itself a massive study. And what we're interested in doing, this is a very, very complicated diagram, and I'm not going to go into it too much, but what we're doing right now is trying to define, as well as possible, a robust measure of resilience that does not rely on a residual. There are many issues with residual calculations, but what we eventually want to do is take as much data that we can, that we are able to harmonize across all of those cohorts, feed them into machine learning models, and be able to extract features that are sort of predictive of whether it might be biological resistance or cognitive resilience. And what we're interested in doing is not just feeding the model the features and not caring about, a subgroup, or individual differences. We want to run these models both stratified by sex and gender, but also thinking about race and ethnicity. And so this is sort of a project that we have. We were very lucky to get funded on an R01 to do it. Dr. Colin Birkenbiel in our lab is really driving this work. Now, there are lots of knowledge gaps that remain when thinking about sex and gender in the context of brain reserve and cognitive resilience and these other terms. We don't know much about gender inequalities. We don't know a huge amount about the intersection between sex and gender and these modifiable risk factors, although there is a lot more work in this space coming, which is very exciting, given there's NIH interest in being able to fund a target funding for this type of work. We also understand that sort of resilience changes dynamically across time, and we're seeing that, we're observing that directly, particularly in women. We need to understand this further. The biological mechanisms still remain to be seen. So work by Dr. Gillian Coughlin in my lab really focuses on sort of hormones, hormone therapy, menopause age, and other related reproductive factors that might be impacting cognitive resilience of women. We also focus a lot in our lab on the X chromosome. There's lots of work that needs to be done that is not being done so far yet. We need to focus on pathological resistance. And the other really important part, which is the final point here, is sex disaggregation. In all of our work, not just observational findings, but actually clinical trials need to be doing this a lot. And this was an editorial that I wrote a little while back. I am now going to try and show a video, hopefully it will work, just to highlight what we don't know. And this is an example just in the lay audience. And I saw this documentary last year and it really struck me. So hopefully exactly. Why don't we? It's absolutely atrocious when in fact, most of the studies involve at least 70% participation by women, particularly in aging studies. And yet most of the studies that I deal with, so I do a lot of secondary data analysis, most cohorts do not collect any information on reproductive history or menopause. It's atrocious. And it's absolutely knowable information. And this is where we need to change the paradigm. There are so many new initiatives coming out right now, particularly in the United States. We are focusing right now on the fantastic initiatives by Dr. Jill Biden and her husband, and very good partner, I believe, Dr. Joe Biden, Mr. Joe Biden, President Joe Biden, who have both been at the forefront of women's health research and wanting to really inject a lot of funding and new initiatives in this space. And this has only been in the last 12 months. It's very exciting. We also have within the United States, the Annis Bowers Women's Brain Health Initiative, which is interested in trying to leverage multiple engaged researchers across the United States and North America to try to really get to the bottom of sort of women's health, particularly in the space of aging and Alzheimer's disease. And that's where we want to launch, apologies, hopefully you can see it, where we want to launch something called the Longitudinal Menopause Project. And what we want to do in this particular project is gather as many women as we can across many walks of life, which unfortunately has not been done as much until now, but is starting to be done more in this space. And SWAN was a beautiful example of this, starting these initiatives decades ago. And we want to deeply phenotype women between the ages of 40 to 60 and follow them for as long as we possibly can. I call it a time capsule study, where we can follow these women as long as we can and see what happens to their brain and try to optimize brain health. And I just wanted to end with this final video. This is a video that was created by the director of the Annis Bowers Women's Brain Health Initiative, Dr. Emily Jacobs, who is one of the most inspiring women I've ever come across. And I just wanted to leave you with this one point to think about, and really I hope to ignite this desire and excitement to think about sex and gender when thinking about brain resilience and optimizing brain health. See if this is going to work.
Let's start with some good news. Neuroscience is having a moment. We are learning more about our brains than ever before. Over 50,000 neuroimaging articles have been published since 1995, shedding light on the most complex organ in the human body. Of those 50,000 articles, about half of the test subjects are women, and yet only half of 1% center on matters specific to women's bodies. Wait, that can't be right. Half of 1%? Guess that brings us to the bad news. Half of 1% is so damn small. It's this small and this little. If you made a pie chart, let's say boysenberry, half of 1% is that. There. That's the entirety of what we know about brain health and the fork crumbs.
Here's a list of things we know more about than the female brain.
The ocean floor, male pattern baldness,
Dinos.
erectile dysfunction, how to make erectile dysfunction medicine chewable and yummy, artificial sheep uteruses, LeBron James's off-season diet,
Outer space.
outer space, meaning if men really were from Mars and women were actually from Venus, we might know more about menopause by now. Even in cases like Alzheimer's, which mostly affects women, preclinical research relies on male models. The assumption is if it works for men, it works. And that doesn't work. The most recently approved Alzheimer's drug shows positive effects primarily in men. One size fits all is actually one size fits half. And in this case, it's the wrong half. When 99.5% of all neuroscience research excludes matters of women's health, mysterious things stay that way.
Why do women get Alzheimer's more often than men?
Is my birth control making me depressed?
Are concussions different in girls?
Why can't I remember anyone's name anymore?
Why am I so sleepy,
Sad.
hungry? Am I undercaffeinated or is this a menopause thing?
Jury is still out because nobody bothered to put any women on the jury. The male body has been the standard since always. Lab rats, male. Clinical test subjects, men. The tenured neuroscience faculty, 80% tweed elbow patches. But what if, maybe, what if we set fire to the status quo? Demand better, broader data.
Study women.
Thousands of them. We start a revolution in neuroscience. Or join those who already have.
And with that, thank you very much. Don't I have a pen?